Hey guys, how is everybody? Well, you see what we got here, don't you? That's right, it must be time for another Quadrajet video. I've been getting a lot of emails from all of you about different kinds of Quadrajet problems and things like that, and I've been really happy to hear from you and glad to help you, and I've tried to respond as much as I could. But the one thing that made me decide to make another video or two is that I'm getting a lot of the same kind of problems through email. So I thought, well, maybe I can just make a video that'll maybe help you guys do some diagnostics and things like that on your carburetor. And some of this is maybe Quadrajet specific, but it'll really apply for any kind of carburetor. So don't feel like you're being left out if you've got maybe a Holly or something like that. They're not the same, but they're really not that far different either. So join in and we'll just talk about these carburetors some more and see if we can cover some of the common complaints that you guys have been having and maybe help you figure out how to fix it. So first things first, on the carburetor, any carburetor in a Quadrajet, any kind of carburetor, you need to be sure that your vacuum lines are good on there. Any kind of vacuum lines hooked to the carburetor, you need to be sure they're not rotted or broken or missing or problems like that, because a carburetor, if it's in good shape, even just a broken vacuum line can cause it to act funny. So that's one thing you always want to check. I have people ask me, they say, well, I'm not using this vacuum line or this vacuum line or this vacuum line or whatever it is. They say, well, maybe will that cause it to run funny? Well, it's like this. The carburetor does not care if you use a particular vacuum port like this one or this one or this one. It doesn't care if you use those or not. The only thing it cares about is if you're not using it, if you've got it plugged off with a good, piece of hose with something in it or whatever you want to use, vacuum cap preferably. So, it doesn't care. The carburetor doesn't care about vacuum lines. These are just here if you need them. If you need a ported vacuum line, you use this one. If you have one just manifold vacuum, you might use this one or this one. I don't know if this one's got any on the back of it, but yeah, it's got one back here too. So right there, it's one for that. So the carburetor, it doesn't care whether you use it or not. So just make sure that you have them plugged off. If you're not running a vacuum port, plug them off. And also, you need to check on the base plate. These always usually have some kind of a insulator or a gasket under it. You need to make sure that's in good shape and not leaking vacuum. Because I had a Impala. First car I ever had was a Chevy Impala, a 71, and it had a carburetor just like this one on it, and it'd been rebuilt more than once, and it just never worked right. The car never ran exactly right. It would always idle rough, and it had a off idle hesitation, and just really never worked exactly right until one day, probably a year after I started driving that car. I got poking around. I might actually have to take the carburetor off for some reason and pulled the carburetor off, and sure enough, the base plate gasket down here is one of those that was about 1/4 of an inch thick. Had a big crack in it back here, right on one side right here. It was leaking vacuum, and I just never known it. And I replaced that and put the carburetor back on, no other changes, and it ran like a dream. Hesitation was gone. The rough idle was gone. I just couldn't believe it. So, number one thing, check your vacuum lines, check your gasket, make sure the carburetor's tight. You don't have to torque it down like you're trying to connect a steel building together. Just make sure it's snug. Second thing, and this is also important, on a carburetor car, you need to make sure that you check the ignition timing. Ignition timing can cause symptoms that very closely mimic carburetor problems. If the timing's too far advanced, you can't ever get the engine to slow down and idle at the right speed. If it's too retarded. It just won't run right. It may not idle at all. In fact, I went around and around and around on another car I had one time before I started really trying to learn about carburetors. I had one that just would not idle on the idle circuit. If you crank the idle screw way in, it'd finally idle. But, you know, it was on the main circuit and it wasn't idling. So sure enough, I checked the ignition timing and it was like 10 degrees retarded. So put the ignition timing back up where it's supposed to be to spec, ran perfectly. So, you know, when you're having carburetor problems, cover the basics first. Don't just assume it's something in the carburetor, because it may very well not be. It may be something else going on. Like I said, a vacuum leak or timing's off somehow. So check those basics first before you tear into this thing. Now, seems like the number one complaint I've been hearing from you folks of these Quadrajets is that it runs rich. Before we talk about that specifically, let me tell you about how carburetors work in a simplified manner. Carburetors, like a 4-barrel Quadrajet like this one is, have 3 circuits. The circuit is something that passes fuel in order for the engine to run. It may also pass a mixture of air and fuel, emulsion. But they usually have 3 main circuits on a 4-barrel. A 2-barrel carburetor may only have 2 circuits. There's actually 4. I'll get into the 4th one in a little bit. But first thing you have an idle circuit. That's where you have these screws, these idle adjustment screws. I've talked to you in another video about those, how to adjust those. Those control the idle mixture. So that's where you start out to deal with an idle problem. It has nothing to do with your idle speed screw over here. These are your mixture screws. This is fuel air mixture. Second circuit that every carburetor has is called a main circuit. It comes off as you open the gas up. It transitions off the main circuit. Off the idle circuit into the main circuit. That's where you have jets, and that's what the engine runs off of from, say, 1,000 RPM up to infinity, or how fast it'll turn. And so that's where the engine spends most of its time operating, is on the main circuit. And then, like a Quadrajet or a Holly, has a secondary circuit. That's a circuit that only works when you kick the 4-barrel open and it's doing its thing and you got your foot on the floor. That's when it starts drawing fuel